Um, so back in 1955, there were like over 500,000 Americans locked inside psychiatric institutions.
Yeah, staggering number.
Right. But then if you fast forward a few decades, that hospitalization rate dropped by an astonishing 92%.
Which is a massive shift.
It is. And,
Huh.
on paper, that sounds like this monumental triumph of modern medicine and human rights.
Yeah.
Like, we emptied the asylums.
That's the narrative, yeah.
But then you look at the populations of our local jails, our state prisons, and our city's homeless shelters today, and you realize that straight line of progress is, well, it's actually an illusion. So welcome to the deep dive.
It really is the absolute definition of a nonlinear history. I mean, we are tracing a journey from ancient practices of like literally drilling holes into skulls to the nightmare of the 19th century asylum, all the way to navigating the modern labyrinth of insurance parity laws.
Exactly. And to our listener, if you want to understand the invisible forces shaping the world around you, you are in the right place. Because understanding this incredibly messy, tragic history is completely crucial to understanding the homelessness and prison crises that you see in your own community right now.
That's all connected.
It totally is. Now, because this topic spans centuries of really complex medical and systemic history, I'm going to briefly slip on the student hat today, just to make sure we hit all the foundational questions.
And I suppose that means I am officially stepping into the lecturer role.
You are. It's your job to guide us through the historical narrative, but as a student, I am definitely going to be scrutinizing and pushing back on the policies we uncover.
Oh, I welcome the scrutiny. It is a really heavy, complex topic, and, well, my job is to lay out the systemic realities that have brought us to where we are right now.
Excellent. So our grounding material today is section 16.1 of chapter 16 from Psychology 2E. And before we jump into the really dark history of how we used to treat the mind, let's establish our modern baseline.
Good idea.
I really want to look at the scale of the issue today.
Yeah.
And, who's actually getting help.
Well, the scale is massive. Section 16.1 grounds us in data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, specifically from 2017. And in that year alone, 18.9% of U.S. adults experience mental illness.
18.9. That is nearly 1 in 5 adults. I mean,
Yeah.
It's not a fringe issue. It is a fundamental aspect of the human condition.
Precisely. And the numbers for youth are just as significant. For younger children, ages 8 to 15, roughly 13% experience mental illness in a given year.
Wow.
But, the prevalence isn't even the most alarming part of the textbook's data.
No.
No, the staggering part is the treatment gap. Out of that, nearly 20% of adults experiencing mental illness, only 14.8% actually receive treatment.
That's a huge drop-off.
Yeah. And for children with disorders, only about half, like 50.6% receive treatment within that past year.
Wait, looking at those treatment numbers for children, a massive discrepancy just, jumps out at me from the textbook's charts.
The ADHD numbers.
Yes. Children with ADHD or conduct disorders are far more likely to receive treatment than children with anxiety disorders.
Yeah, they are.
And as a student of this material, it almost feels like, treatment isn't always about healing the child's internal distress. It seems like it's often about managing their external disruption, for the convenience of the adults around them.
That is a highly perceptive way to frame it, and it really strikes at the core of how society perceives suffering.
How so?
Well, behavioral disorders like ADHD or conduct issues are externally disruptive. A child acting out in a classroom demands immediate attention because it literally brings the environment to a halt.
Right, the teacher can't ignore it.
Exactly. It prompts teachers and parents to mandate treatment because it affects them too.
Whereas anxiety is profoundly isolating.
Yes. A child sitting quietly in the back of the room, internally paralyzed by a panic attack, isn't disrupting the math lesson. That's so sad to think about.
It is. It is much easier for the surrounding adults to overlook because the suffering is invisible to everyone but the child.
So even today, with all our modern diagnostic manuals and medical infrastructure, millions of people still just quietly slip through the cracks.
Unfortunately, yes.
But at least we recognize these internal struggles as medical issues now. When you look back at ancient and medieval societies, they didn't have the vocabulary of neurotransmitters or psychology.
No, not at all.
So how did they handle unexplainable behavior?
They viewed it entirely through a supernatural lens. For much of human history, if someone experienced a severe depressive episode, manic delusions, or auditory hallucinations,
Things we'd easily diagnose today.
right, Society back then attributed it to demonic possession, witchcraft, or the wrath of an angry god.
Which makes sense in a weird way, because if you don't understand the biology of the brain, you have to find some framework to explain why your neighbor is suddenly talking to someone who isn't there. Exactly. It's human nature to find a cause. But because the diagnosis was supernatural, the interventions were horrific.
You're right.
Religious figures conducted exorcisms, many individuals were imprisoned, executed, or simply driven to the fringes of society to beg. And the textbook details a specific, terrifying early practice called trephining.
Oh, the drilling.
Yes. Healers would physically drill a small hole into the afflicted individual's skull.
I can't even imagine.
The prevailing theory was that this hole would allow the evil spirits trapped inside the body to physically escape.
I was thinking about the mechanics of trephining, and it essentially feels like trying to fix a software glitch by taking a physical drill to a computer's hard drive.
That's a great analogy.
Right, like you have a malfunction in the mind, but because they lacked any concept of psychology, they attacked the hardware, the physical bone of the skull.
Yeah.
The logic is just fundamentally mismatched to the reality of the illness.
And the physical toll was exactly what you would expect. Most people treated this way died from trauma or infection. Yet, this supernatural fear dictated policy for centuries. I mean, during the witch hunts spanning the late 1400s to the late 1600s, tens of thousands of mentally ill people worldwide were accused of making pacts with the devil.
And they were burned at the stake or hanged.
Exactly.
The cruelty of that is just staggering. At what point does society finally realize that burning people at the stake is a catastrophic failure? Like, how does the systemic shift happen where we move from executing individuals to actually creating dedicated spaces for them?
So the shift begins in the 18th century, marking the birth of the asylum.
Okay.
However, we must be really careful not to view this era through rose-colored glasses. The primary societal goal of the early asylum was not therapeutic treatment. The goal was ostracization.
Hiding the problem away. Out of sight, out of mind.
That is the exact mechanism of the era. People deemed unusual were removed from the public sphere. They were often placed in windowless dungeons, literally chained to walls or beds, beaten and largely ignored by caregivers.
It sounds like a prison, not a hospital.
It basically was. The concept of the asylum didn't truly pivot toward treatment until reformers began to intervene.
Like who?
Well, in 1795, a French physician named Philippe Pinel argued that these individuals were patients suffering from illnesses, not monsters.
Okay, a huge paradigm shift.
Right. He went into the Salpêtrière Asylum in Paris and famously ordered the chains to be physically removed from the patients.
Which proved to be revolutionary because simply speaking to people humanely allowed many of them to actually improve and leave the hospital.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the 19th century United States and the work of Dorothea Dix.
Yes. Dorothea Dix was a formidable force. She systematically investigated the care of the mentally ill poor across the country and uncovered a completely unregulated system rife with severe abuse.
So she exposed it.
She did. And she relentlessly lobbied state legislatures and the U.S. Congress, forcing them to allocate funding for the first American mental asylums, which she envisioned as safe, compassionate havens.
Okay, lecturer, here is a massive paradox that I really need to push back on.
Let's hear it.
So, Dix Fights for Asylum says this grand, compassionate reform. But Section 16.1 outlines how these exact institutions mutated into nightmares.
They did.
The textbook points to the Willard Psychiatric Center in upstate New York. People were committed there for decades. They were submerged in cold baths for unimaginable periods. And it mentions the use of electroshock treatments in the 1940s.
Right.
Now, today, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is a highly regulated, safe procedure done under anesthesia with muscle relaxants. But the way they administered the shocks back then literally fractured patients' spines.
It was incredibly brutal.
So how does a movement built on removing chains end up breaking patients' backs?
It's a tragic paradox. To understand it, you have to look at the life cycle of institutions. Good intentions without sustained funding, rigorous oversight, and evolving scientific understanding inevitably breed institutional rot.
Institutional rot.
Yes. What happened at Willard and places like it was a cascade of systemic failures. States built these massive facilities, but over time, they slashed the operating budgets.
So you have massive overcrowding combined with a severe lack of trained staff.
Exactly. The staff becomes completely overwhelmed. They begin relying on physical restraints and crude, unregulated medical interventions, like those early electroshock therapies you mentioned.
Just to keep people in line.
Right, not to heal the patients, but simply to control the sheer volume of bodies on the ward. And because these asylums were deliberately built far away from city centers to hide the patients, the abuse compounded in the dark.
Entirely shielded from public scrutiny.
Yes. And just to put things in perspective, Willard didn't fully close its doors until 1995.
1995.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the modern internet, and yet we still had the remnants of a 19th century asylum system operating in upstate New York. It's clear the asylum model was fundamentally broken.
Beyond broken.
Which brings us to the next massive paradigm shift. What actually forced the collapse of the asylum era?
The collapse was driven by a dual catalyst in the mid-20th century, one medical and one political. This is the era of deinstitutionalization.
Okay, walk me through the medical breakthrough first, because it changes the mechanics of how we treat severe disorders.
Sure. So in 1954, antipsychotic medications were introduced, and they gained widespread use throughout the 1960s.
Right.
For the first time in human history, there was a pharmacological way to control severe symptoms of psychosis, such as hallucinations and deep delusions.
Just with a pill.
Exactly. By altering brain chemistry, specifically how neurotransmitters like dopamine function, these medications reduced the symptoms that previously led to patients being physically restrained.
Which suddenly makes the idea of releasing these patients seem feasible. I mean, you don't need a massive institution if a daily pill can manage the most severe symptoms.
Exactly.
And that sets the stage for the political catalyst.
It does. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act. The legislative vision was to empty out the abusive state hospitals and provide federal funding to build a network of community-based centers. The idea was that patients could live in their own neighborhoods, sleep in their own beds, and receive localized outpatient treatment.
Now, earlier I mentioned that the institutionalized population dropped by 92% between 1955 and 1994. The textbook frames this era of deinstitutionalization around that specific statistic.
Right, the mass exodus.
But I have to challenge the narrative of this being a pure victory. As a student looking at the systemic outcomes, was the 1963 Act really a beautiful vision of community care? Or was it just a politically convenient excuse for state governments to slash their massive hospital budgets under the guise of liberation?
You hit the nail on the head. The motivation might have been noble at the federal level, but the execution at the state level was a logistical disaster.
Why? What went wrong?
The fatal flaw of deinstitutionalization was that the funding did not follow the patients out the hospital doors.
Oh, wow. So the communities were essentially left to fend for themselves.
Absolutely. The newly established community centers were chronically underfunded. The staff lacked the specialized training required to handle severe, complex illnesses like schizophrenia.
Because they were used to outpatient therapy, maybe, not severe institutional cases.
Right. And most devastatingly, policymakers completely ignored the basic survival logistics for the patients being released. They handed individuals a prescription for antipsychotics, but provided zero infrastructure for housing, food security, or job placement.
You take someone who's been institutionalized for 20 years, whose entire reality was dictated by ward schedules, and you just drop them onto a city sidewalk. I mean, the fallout is inevitable.
It is, and we are living in the reality of that fallout today. The textbook points out that currently, 26% of homeless adults living in shelters experience severe mental illness.
26%.
Yes. Deinstitutionalization didn't cure the patients. It simply shifted the population from hospital wards to park benches.
And more disturbingly, to prison cells.
Yes.
Because the statistics on the penal system are where the scale of this policy failure truly crystallizes.
The carceral system has essentially become the default mental health infrastructure of the United States. The text cites a 2006 special report showing over 705,000 adults with mental health issues incarcerated in state prisons.
Well, that's horrifying.
Add to that another 78,000 in the federal system and nearly 500,000 in local jails.
That is well over 1 million individuals.
Yeah.
And people with mental illnesses are also overrepresented in probation and parole populations at like 2 to 4 times the rate of the general public. And the most tragic part of this mechanism is that a prison environment is uniquely designed to destroy mental health.
Oh, it is the antithesis of a therapeutic environment. The sensory overload, the constant threat of violence, the profound isolation, especially, the use of solitary confinement as a punitive measure for behavioral issues.
Which is basically torture for someone with a severe disorder.
Yeah, exactly. All of this triggers deep psychological disturbances. Incarceration actively exacerbates existing conditions, generating severe trauma and long-term PTSD.
So the narrative arc goes from drilling holes in skulls to locking people in windowless asylum dungeons to abandoning them on the streets to finally locking them inside state
Then
penitentiaries.
grim.
That is an incredibly heavy realization. So if that is the systemic failure of the past century, how does the actual medical infrastructure function for a person seeking help today, like the ones who aren't incarcerated?
Well, the modern landscape of psychiatric care is highly fragmented. Instead of massive state asylums, a treatment is decentralized to psychiatric hospitals and local community hospital wards.
Okay.
But the defining characteristic of modern inpatient care is its extreme brevity. We are talking about average hospital stays of less than 2 weeks, and very frequently, just a few days.
Just a few days. That feels incredibly short. Is that a medical best practice, or is that a financial mechanism dictating the care?
It is overwhelmingly financial. Psychiatric hospitalization is extraordinarily expensive. It averages between $800 and $1,000 per night.
Oh my God.
Because of this astronomical cost, insurance coverage strictly limits the length of stay. As a result, hospitals operate more like emergency triage centers.
Ah,
Individuals are typically only admitted if they present an imminent, immediate threat to themselves or to others.
so we basically treat psychiatric crises the way we treat acute physical trauma in an ER. You stabilize the immediate hemorrhage, make sure the patient won't die today, and then you just push them out the door.
That is exactly the protocol. And access to the system is divided into two pathways: voluntary and involuntary treatment.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure, voluntary treatment is the standard model we usually envision. An individual experiences distress, such as deep anxiety or depressive symptoms, and they actively choose to seek therapy to find relief.
And involuntary treatment implies the individual does not have a choice in the matter.
Yes, involuntary treatment is mandated by the state. This often intersects with the justice system, such as a judge ordering weekly anger management or substance abuse counseling as a strict condition of parole.
Oh, right.
It is also heavily utilized by state child protective services.
In what way?
Well, if children are removed from a home due to neglect, the parents may be legally required to attend psychiatric or addiction facilities, with the ultimate goal being, achieving family reunification.
Okay, let's talk about the logistics of paying for all this, because you mentioned the massive costs earlier. Who is footing the bill for the average person's therapy, and what structural barriers prevent people from accessing it?
The two massive barriers today are financial coverage and geographic availability.
Okay.
On the financial front, there was a significant legislative shift with the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008.
The Parity Act.
Right. Prior to this law, insurance companies could blatantly discriminate against mental health claims. They could refuse coverage entirely or set arbitrary, highly restrictive caps on how many visits you could have.
So the Parity Act was designed to equalize the playing field. Like, the legal mechanism meant that an insurance company couldn't charge you a $30 copay for a physical asthma checkup, but demand a $200 out-of-pocket fee for a trauma therapy session.
That is the legal intent, yes. Ensuring copays, deductibles, and visit limits are equitable. But legal parity means absolutely nothing if you hit the second barrier. Geography. The textbook highlights a devastating rural crisis in America. Over 85% of federally designated mental health professional shortage areas are located in rural communities.
85%. So you could have phenomenal insurance coverage thanks to the Parity Act. But if you live in a rural county and the nearest in-network psychiatrist is 150 miles away, that parity is functionally useless.
Precisely. And this geographic void forces primary care physicians and often armed law enforcement officers to become the first-line mental health providers in these communities.
Wild.
They are doing their absolute best, but they lack the intensive, specialized clinical training required to navigate complex psychiatric emergencies.
Right.
When you combine this severe lack of access with the persistent social stigma surrounding mental illness, especially in tight-knit rural areas, and financial hurdles like just taking time off work to drive that far, the result is tragic.
What's the impact?
Approximately 2/3 of children and adults experiencing symptoms receive absolutely no care at all.
2/3.
Yeah.
Stepping back and just synthesizing this entire journey we've been on today, it is breathtaking in its scope. We started with ancient societies attributing complex brain chemistry to demonic possession. We moved to the 18th century, where reformers tried to build sanctuaries that inevitably rotted into abusive nightmares. We saw the 1960s introduce miracle drugs that emptied the hospitals, but due to catastrophic policy failures, basically built a pipeline straight to mass incarceration.
The prison pipeline, yeah.
And today, we navigate a scientifically grounded, yet deeply underfunded and geographically broken model.
It is a profound evolution, but my final takeaway as the lecture today is a reminder that this timeline hasn't ended.
No.
The massive overrepresentation of the mentally ill in our prison systems and the millions slipping through the cracks of rural health care prove that we are still actively writing the history of mental health treatment. We have not reached the finish line.
And that leads me to a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. We sit here in the modern era and we look back at the 18th century dungeons and the unregulated electroshock therapies of the 1940s with absolute horror. We marvel at how a society could be so blind to its own cruelty. But imagine the students of the future, 100 years from now, studying us. What current practices, perhaps our system of treating severe trauma with 72-hour insurance-mandated hospital limits, or our reliance on armed police officers to handle medical crises, will those future students look back on as the dark ages of the 2020s?
It's a sobering question that really demands our attention.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll catch you next time.